Grace to you and peace in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. And welcome to the 112th SPRUNT Lectures here at Union Presbyterian Seminary. My name is Clay McCauley, and I have the privilege of serving now in my 8th year as alumni director for this seminary. And we are so delighted to have each and every one of you here with us this night. I hope you've had an opportunity as you have registered to perhaps pick up and review the schedule of events that will be occurring over the next 2.5 days. I wanted to remind you of some of those as we begin this evening. If you have not had a chance to register, the registration desk will reopen again in the morning at 7:30 in front of Holderness Dining Room. And there will also be a breakfast held there at 8 o'clock, and you are invited to come join us for that opportunity to eat and share with one another. If you were able to order and bring copies of books by our SPRUNT lecturer, Dr. Keri Day, and our SPRUNT preacher, Dr. Kenyatta Gilbert, and have those books with you, a book signing opportunity will occur Wednesday morning in the Holderness Dining Room before the 4th lecture. That's Wednesday morning between 8 and 8:45. We will reconvene here in Watts Chapel at 9 o'clock tomorrow for Dr. Keri Day's 2nd lecture in the series on undomesticated faith, a decolonial theology of spirit, a lecture entitled Rerouting Theology, Spirit as First Word. All are invited to a reception in honor of Brian and Sharon Blunt and the unveiling of the presidential portrait of Dr. Blunt to be held following the 3rd lecture. The reception will occur at 5:30 in the Holderness Dining Room. The lecture, the 3rd lecture, will be here in this room at 4 o'clock. Also, a special reception will occur on Wednesday morning at 10:30 to honor our 2023 distinguished alum, Rosalind Murphy, who is here with us this night, and our 2023 Black Alumni Association trailblazer, Hoffman Brown. To assist in transportation on campus this evening and all day tomorrow and on Wednesday, you'll notice we do have a golf cart available that can take you towards your car or wherever you are staying here on campus or wherever you need to go. That golf cart will be available after tonight's lecture. I now call on our president, Dr. Brian Blunt, who will formally welcome you and host this evening's lecture.
Thank you very much, Clay. I remember very vividly back in the year 2008 when I had the opportunity to welcome all of you to my very first SPRUNT lectures as president of the seminary. And it's a joy to look out over your faces and to welcome you here to this time just before I retire. So it's been a wonderful opportunity to hear some fabulous lecturers across these past 16 years. And we have a wonderful, fabulous lecturer for us tonight. So I'm going to enjoy these next 3 days tremendously as we are challenged, as we hear some wonderful lectures by Dr. Day, and I'll be talking about her in just a moment, but also to hear from Dr. Kenyatta Gilbert, who was a student of mine, so I'm looking forward to hearing him as well. And then a dear friend, Dr. Ted Wardlaw, President Emeritus of Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. So it's a wonderful lineup of folk. I hope that you will have opportunity not only to gather with each other and to see each other, those of you who haven't seen friends for some time, and for our current students, I hope you'll have an opportunity to hear from these two scholars and to be enriched as they extend the range of what you're hearing from our wonderful faculty each and every day you enjoy them in class. But know that you are welcomed here for this lecture series, and we are grateful for your presence and look forward to engaging you throughout this time, these next 3 days. Now we are going to stand with opportunity to sing our opening hymn, number 634, To God Be the Glory. Let us stand and sing if you are able. Please be seated. Let us pray. Gracious God, open our hearts and our minds as we are filled with the wonders that come from research, scholarship this evening. Help us to hear in new ways, to be challenged, to be a part of a prophetic witness, that as we hear and are uplifted, as we are educated, as we are taught, that we might be able to hear in ways that open and challenge us to new possibilities of action and university, along with a certificate in gender and sexuality studies. Dr. Day has held teaching positions at Tennessee State, Bright Divinity School, Yale University Divinity School, and of course, Princeton Theological Seminary. She has also served in a professional ministry capacity as a campus student chaplain at Vanderbilt and as an associate pastor of the Cathedral of Praise Church in Nashville. A gifted academic, she is the recipient of numerous awards, among them the Fund for Theological Education Doctoral Fellow and Dissertation Fellow, the Wabash Programs for Pre-Tenure Theological Faculty, and Fellowship for Research and Writing, the Catherine Saylor Hill Faculty Excellence Award at Bright Divinity School. She has served as a delegate to White House Religious Scholar Briefing on Faith-Based Initiatives, and as a senior fellow on the Between the Times consultation for tenured scholars on writing and teaching in theological education. Dr. Day is the author of 4 books: Unfinished Business, Black Women, the Black Church, and the Struggle to Thrive in America, Orbis Press; Religious Resistance to Neoliberalism, Womanist and Black Feminist Perspectives, Palgrave Macmillan; Notes of a Native Daughter, Testifying in Theological Education, Erdman's Publishing; and Azusa Reimagined, a Radical Vision of Religious and Democratic Belonging, Stanford University Press. She has an impressive array of journal and book chapter articles, among them Rethinking Hope, the Importance of Radical Racial Realism for Womanist Religious Thought, The Future of Sexual Inclusion, Anti-Black Racism, Black Patriarchy, and Prospects for Political Democracy, The Imago Dei, a Critical Investigation, African American Theology and Doctrines of God, Saving Black America, a Womanist Analysis of Faith-Based Initiatives, African American Liberative Ethics, and Global Economics and U.S. Public Policy, Prospects on the Means and Ends of Liberation for the Global Poor. I could go on. What you can sense, even from this abridged reporting of Dr. Day's work, is that she bridges the gap between intellectual inquiry and human, social, and political engagement. Her theology discourse in the Guild drives her prophetic engagement in the public arena. I look forward to seeing that connection come vividly to life as she engages us here during these lectures. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Keri L. Day.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. It is wonderful to be with you for the next 3 days to explore the SPRUNT lectures. I first want to take the time to offer some thanks. First to President Blount. Thank you for those just gracious words. I really appreciate the invitation. I was sharing with President Blount that I've been talking about this for about 6 months with really any faculty peer who was willing to be stopped in the hallway to have a conversation and to offer a kind of glimpse of what I was doing. And so just elated to be with you to think together about this theme. I also want to thank the faculty and the staff, those that I've known quite well that are on faculty for some time, and of course some new faces as well. I look forward to conversing again and thinking with you over these next 3 days. To the alums that have come and that are present, as I look into the audience, I see clergy people deeply committed to the church, activists, just all sorts of people that are gathering, right, for 3 days to sharpen what we do and why we do in our ministry to church and world. And then finally to the students, right? We're here because of the students as well. To the students, thank you. I look forward to thinking with you. I look forward to your questions, right? To your ahas, to your pushbacks. I look forward to all of that as we journey together for 3 days. I would be remiss if I didn't say that I deeply honor the legacy of the late Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon. I stand here because of her legacy. And so I wanted to definitely honor that. And as sort of a side note to also, although I don't see her here, the Reverend Dr. Melanie Jones, I think Melody just received, defended her dissertation, who is continuing this important work of Dr. Cannon in the center. It's just marvelous, and it's having sort of a national ripple effect. It's really shaping and speaking to the broader national project of theological education. And so I definitely wanted to honor her on tonight. And finally, I wanted to dedicate these lectures. I wanted to dedicate these lectures to the women of Brown Street Church of God in Christ. my beginning. The mothers of the church, the women in the pew, who in many ways taught me who I was and whose I was. And so I want to honor them by dedicating these lectures to them. So again, I am elated to deliver the SPRUNT lectures over the next 3 days. And as a side note, the person I've been talking to the most about my work has been my 2-year-old daughter, Ariella Rose. And the great thing about talking to her is everything is met with, yes, mommy, which is good, right? Terrible twos, yes, mommy, I'll take that. So I've been having a lot of discussion with her as a sounding board for these lectures. My SPRUNT lectures are based on a new manuscript I am presently writing. And I'm actually at the beginning stages of writing. So in many ways, I consider these lectures that I'm going to be doing over the next 3 days experimental in how I'm beginning to think about the theme. Hence, my deep excitement, whether it's at the table or in the hallway, not just in the formal Q&A, of being in conversation and dialogue with you. The emerging questions and arguments you will encounter in these lectures are driven by 2 motivating factors. First, these lectures are driven by my own existential queries, doubts, concerns, and hopes about what Christian faith is and the work it should do in the world. Yet to ask what Christian faith is involves addressing how we image or imagine God, as our ideas of God shape how we think about Christian identity. I desire to become clear to myself first because of my own internal becoming in terms of my sense of faith, and then others second, on what Black Pentecostalism can contribute to this discussion. That is reimagining Christian faith. As I have already written in my book, Azusa Reimagined, to talk about God for early Pentecostals was to talk about what the Spirit is doing first, as God mediates divine presence through the Spirit, offering us knowledge about who God is and what God does. And so, my search for a decolonial theology of spirit engages this question about God and spirit through Black Pentecostal imaginings, inching closer to my own account of Christian faith and the work it does in the world. Second, in these lectures, I am motivated by historian of religion Charles Long's insight that, and I quote him here, quote, "The visibility of the Black community in America is our challenge and opportunity to develop a theology of freedom for humanity, a new humanity," end quote. With respect to cultivating theologies of freedom, Long also offers another incisive insight, and I want to quote him at length here. Quote, "Do our modes of knowing, critical and or otherwise, bracket too much of the human condition that makes knowledge possible? How do legitimated knowledges abstract away the historical and material realities of the world? In other words, how and in what ways do dominant regimes of knowledge serve as a prison house of thought that facilitate dehumanization by design," end quote. For these lectures, these questions offer a necessary intervention into dominant Christian theological discourses that fail to provide freedom and flourishing because their epistemic foundations, not just their content, bracket and even excise out the diverse articulations of how the divine, how God is experienced and understood in the world. I am concerned that our current Christian dogmas, creeds, or just words about God often domesticate Christian faith, or to use Charles Long's words here, serve as a prison house of thought that ends up facilitating dehumanization by design. Here for Long, it's not just the effects of theology as such, some in the sense that it's simply applied wrongly, but rather there's something about the form, the epistemic shape of oftentimes our theological knowledge that we need to investigate. I think that Azusa's world of Black religious experience intervenes here. Because I think our accounts are often trapped or tamed within a narrow philosophical or totalizing ontological statements or classical metaphysical statements about God, which can dismiss, ignore, or even refuse experiences of how God is actually at work in the world. Experiences that do not easily conform to or affirm dominant Christian theological formulas about God. And so I think Azusa's world of Black religious experiences intervenes in this kind of theological domestication. Again, think here the image that Long gives us of this prison house of thought, and frees us up to see our words about God as ways of facilitating right and just relationships with God and others, rather than capturing and containing some final or ultimate reality of divine life. I desperately want us to be released of this burden on the need to have the final say on divine reality. As this colonial impulse, and I'll be arguing throughout my lectures that this is indeed a colonial impulse, it has led to all kinds of trauma and violence. And I think we must be intellectually honest about this as Christians. So in these lectures, I explore how a decolonial theology of spirit avoids, or at least attempts to avoid, the domestication of our ideas about God and Christian faith. More broadly, in order to elaborate the conditions for the possibility of thinking and being otherwise. Theology not as a prison house of thought, but as a discursive space and practice of wonder and freedom. And I'll say that again. Theology not as a prison house of thought, but as a discursive space and practice of wonder and freedom. Drawing on new materialisms, decolonial theory, and Black religious discourses at the intersections of Black feminism and Black womanism, I specifically argue that a decolonial theology of spirit offers a materialist yet apophatic view of God through the Spirit's operations in the world, which frees theology to function then as a discursive space and practice of wonder and freedom. When the Spirit moves, it participates in an economy of disruption, interrupting the status quo with respect to dominating and traumatizing colonial ways of knowing, being, living, and living, revealing a God who desires radical communion and participation with us in the material worlds we inhabit, offering freedom and quality of life to us. I imagine that the decolonial theology of spirit I offer is a theology of wonder and freedom. So then in this first lecture, I offer a decolonial reading of the Azusa Street Revival of 1906, where, arguably speaking, but where many scholars for the most part would say, where Pentecostalism in the United States was born. And I do this so that you can see, as my interlocutors, you can better understand the decolonial theology of spirit I will offer in the following lectures. So in many ways, this lecture is building upon the book I've just written, Azusa Reimagined. It's sort of bringing you up to speed on precisely why this community, this church, apostolic mission, the Azusa Street Revival is what we know it as, should be read in a decolonial key. Azusa nods in the direction of how the Spirit produces patterns of intimacy and longing that expand, yet contract, and even implode dominant Christian doctrinal categories, beliefs, and modes of sociality in the United States. Azusa's religious experience, mediated, as I'll talk about, through slave religious practices, in particular, offers a way of reading with, against, and even beyond dominant Christian orthodoxy to reconstruct ideas and practices of Christian faithfulness. So now to how Azusa troubled orthodoxy and reconstructs the idea of Christian faithfulness. I want to begin by briefly discussing what is more generally known about the Azusa Street movement. Started in 1906 by an itinerant black clergyman, William Seymour, and as I argue in my book, really, he emerges, his own form of religious praxis emerges out of the rich pastoral and prophetic witness of black women, particularly black domestic women that are moving into church world and leading. William Seymour, along with a congregational community of black washerwomen and black janitors in Los Angeles, California, the Azusa Street Revival was a transgenerational, transracial, and eventually global movement. At Azusa, Chinese, Mexican, German, Irish, Russian, white Americans, and African Americans testified and worshiped together, often greeting each other by declaring, "I am saved, sanctified, and prejudiced removed." As a side note, this particular mantra, maybe some, 5 or 6 decades later, and this is when, of course, myself growing up, it would be, "I am saved, sanctified, and filled with the precious gift of the Holy Ghost." What's interesting is how this statement moves away from the initial sort of social shape of that statement, right? I am saved, sanctified, and prejudice removed. This idea that what it means to speak about salvation is an inherently social matter. Azusa embodied countercultural practices in relation to American racial, ethnic, patriarchal, and class hegemony. In terms of Azusa's interracial vision, it was a black clergyman, Seymour, that led and pastored thousands of white Christians, among others that I just mentioned. Azusa was subversive to the dominant racial reasoning of the day, as seen through a political cartoon in 1906. This is in the Los Angeles Times, depicting white women in the arms of, quote, salivating black men at the altar, with the headline, and I quote the headline, "Crazed white girls in the arms of buck black men." This was a dangerous headline. Black men could get lynched for even looking at a white woman. But Azusa was a context in which black men laid hands on white women freely, scandalous practices for this era. In terms of emancipatory gender norms, when the congregation at Azusa Street organized itself, the 12 elders comprised 5 men and 7 women. The barriers of gender were very briefly overcome at Azusa, which contrasted to much of Baptist and Methodist traditions. Womanist scholar Cheryl Jilks notes that many Baptist and Methodist women left their denominations and joined holiness and Pentecostal communities that participated or came out of the Azusa movement because of Azusa's just treatment of women as legitimate preachers and pastors. And to be fair in describing the founding of Azusa, I do argue in my book that black women guide and birth Seymour's experience of the Spirit, which rethinks black women's role in the founding of Azusa. I would say, therefore, of early Pentecostalism and more broadly of American religiosity, right, as we are experiencing the Pentecostalization of Christian faith around the globe. And I think that this is an important womanist and black feminist interpretation. Although the institutionalization of the Azusa revival gave way to a number of Pentecostal denominations that over time reinscribed patriarchal logics. I'm born and raised in the Church of God in Christ, the acronym COGIC, and women still are not ordained as pastors. In fact, the conversation, I would say perhaps within the next year, the General Assembly will be willing to have this conversation. But thus far, the conversation has not even been invited back to the General Assembly. And so then, as you can see, even though these patriarchal logics were reinscribed in many of these Pentecostal denominations that come out of Azusa, Azusa itself was radically egalitarian in its approach to leadership, allowing women to lead in record numbers. Azusa was also a unique moment in the American religious landscape in terms of class. As most major religious movements, you think here of the Great Awakenings, for example, in America, certainly included black people, but were not started and led by poor black people, as Azusa was. lasting really for 15 years, but the scope of my book, 3 years, when much of the activity was going on. This revival's enfleshment of communion, longing, and belonging across racial, gender, and class categories can be contrasted to the dominant ecclesial and juridical institutions of the day in America that upheld racial apartheid and white superiority. What has been hidden and even erased in relation to Azusa is that Azusa held at the center of its spirit experience, at the center of its liturgy and worship, slave religious practices, which caused a firestorm of controversy on whether this movement was truly Christian. Much of white Pentecostal scholarship argues that those who gravitated toward holiness movements and the early Pentecostal movement left Baptist and Methodist churches due to these churches' failure to live into ideas of sanctification, as well as speaking in tongues as the first evidence of the Spirit's baptism. While this is not entirely incorrect, for Black leaders who founded and led Azusa, it was much more complicated and nuanced. For these Black Christian leaders, they also left Black Baptist and Methodist denominations in defense of the traditions of slave religion, with its oral music traditions and its ecstatic praise practices. As I talk about in my first book, Unfinished Business, whites and many elite Blacks viewed the religious practices of the enslaved as antiquated and primitive, tainted by the sins of slavery and marked by pagan retentions from Africa. Longing to appear respectable to white Christians, many Black Christians felt that slave religion had simply run its course. However, some of the children and grandchildren of the enslaved felt deeply enough about slave religious practices to defend it on biblical and theological grounds. Black Pentecostal scholar Ithiel Clemens notes that persons such as William Seymour certainly can be seen as deeply shaped by practices of slave religion and believed that these practices needed to be preserved. Likewise, Bishop Charles Harrison Mason, C.H. Mason, founder of the largest Pentecostal denomination that I just mentioned I'm a part of, the Church of God in Christ, was deeply influenced by former slave-turned-holiness preacher Amanda Berry Smith, a woman whose brand of Christianity was imbued with slave religious practices and rituals. In 1906, Mason journals that he even saw down at Azusa that slave religious practices constituted the cornerstone of the spirit experience, as people across ethnicities were being initiated into the Spirit through indigenous practices. Historian of Pentecostal studies, Cecile Robeck, recounts that slave religious practices such as tarrying, T-A-R-R-Y-I-N-G, I'll be talking about that in detail in the third lecture. It's a descendant of the ring shout, a West African religious form, and certain forms of Christian conjuring were rituals that people participated in as they experienced the outpouring of God's Spirit. When turning to the archival materials associated with Azusa, firsthand accounts, the formal biographer of the revival, Frank Bartleman, and of course, what constitutes much of my book, the numerous newspaper reports covering the revival, many American white Christian leaders are entirely incapable of reflecting upon and explaining what happens at Azusa, because they defined the Blackness of Azusa, the slave religious practice, the indigenous rituals, the Blackness of Azusa as not Christian. The performative enactment of Blackness through slave religious practices, the spectacle of Black flesh in movement with the Spirit, and the ecstatic encounters between Black, white, Mexican, Chinese, African, and other bodies created a crisis of doctrinal meaning for many white Christian leaders. For example, often called the father of Pentecostalism, there's much debate within Pentecostal studies on who we might attribute to being the founder of Pentecostalism in the U.S., but there's some camp that says Charles Parham. So often called the father of Pentecostalism, Charles Parham recounted that finding the disturbing sight of white people freely associating with blacks and Latinos in crude Negroisms sickened him, and he left the revival insisting that most of those claiming the Holy Spirit baptism were subject to no more than, quote, animal spiritism, end quote. As black scholar Ashawn Crawley gestures, the way that Parham relegated such ecstatic behavior to the realm of the animal, or as animal spiritism, underscores how the animal and blackness were seen as constitutive categories in white Christian theological thought. For white leaders like Parham, Azusa is excessive. It is wild, uncouth, and demonic. It is located outside of Christian Protestantism altogether, of which he writes extensively about this. Yet people at Azusa believed that this excess was the work of the Spirit, a spirit only being revealed through black flesh and the joining of black flesh to other flesh. Azusa then might properly be described as a contested theological space where Christian leaders did not agree on exactly what was transpiring at Azusa. And you see this in the newsletter. You see this in Frank Bartleman's, one would say biography, some would say account, because he is a minister and he's thinking theologically about the activity that's going on at Azusa. But the sense of, even in the first year, it's embattled. Even as it's trying to think about racial and class and gender belonging, it's embattled, right? Because there's not exact agreement on exactly what is transpiring at Azusa, especially when encountering those from the outside that are offering critique and commentary. For some leaders, even internal to the revival, Azusa could primarily be understood as a movement of miracles, signs, and wonders. To many other leaders, including Seymour, Azusa wasn't merely a mirroring of white Christian Protestantism with the inclusion of signs and wonders. Azusa was not a mere representation of white Protestantism or operating within the horizon of dominant white Christian categories of faith. Azusa, as Seymour talks about in his sermons, understood itself to bring something that the Western church never had. Namely, an understanding of Christian community defined by radical patterns of intimacy and belonging across difference, contrasted to the forms of racial and gendered apartheid characteristic of white churches and Western society for centuries, fueled and funded by Christian theology and its doctrinal practices. Many of the leaders at Azusa did not see this movement then as parroting white Christian faith, as the dominant Christian faith was trapped inside the intimacy of white racist existence, to use the theologian Willie Jennings' words. Even Seymour remarks in the Azusa Street newsletter in August of 1906 that Azusa was the true fulfillment of the ancient Acts church and the Reformation through the joining together of nations and tribes through a renunciation of prejudice, in Seymour's case, anti-blackness. So then I contest a reading of Azusa that interprets this religious movement as simply operating within the horizon of dominant white Christian theology, although the Christian West would eventually read and interpret the Azusa Street revival as simply a manifestation of Western Christian pneumatology. That's sort of how Azusa then is cataloged, right? It's how it's classified as a kind of example, robust example of Western Christian pneumatology, being the doctrine of the Spirit. But I want to argue that this is not entirely accurate. Azusa can be seen as expanding and affirming, yet sometimes imploding doctrinal categories altogether. For instance, Azusa is not properly pneumatological for Parham, who I just mentioned, right, who comes down and claims that animal spiritism is going on at the revival, that Azusa is not properly pneumatological for Parham and other white ministers visiting, like the evangelical minister Alma White. According to white Christian leaders at this time, white Christian doctrine, such as the doctrine of the Spirit, is incommensurable and even oppositional to cultural forms of blackness, a la slave religious practices, hence they're demonic. Part of the argument, again, is that they should not be a part of how we think about the operations and work of the Spirit. Moreover, oneness denominations emerge out of Azusa, such as the Pentecostal Assemblies of the World, the acronym PAW, African American denomination, which break from Trinitarian formulations of God that have marked both white and black Christian orthodoxy. I think there are over 2 million blacks and African Americans in PAW today. Azusa demonstrates that as the Spirit is moving through marginalized flesh, black flesh, new doctrinal commitments are emerging and being forged, affirming and yet sometimes imploding dominant Christian doctrinal categories altogether, such as the Trinity. This is the complexity of Azusa. It doesn't neatly follow what has come before in terms of doctrine and orthodoxy even. Azusa then, returning to my previous point, is a contested theological space. Azusa certainly operates from within, yet against and beyond orthodoxy, and forging a new subjectivity and epistemology rooted in the power of black flesh and other flesh marked by the Spirit in all the Spirit's plenitudes of meanings, intimacies, and enactments of belonging. And as a side note, in the second lecture on tomorrow, I'm going to be dealing substantively with this category of flesh and the relationship between flesh and spirit, just as a side note, because I've said this a few times, and I want you to rest assured that I'm going to be dealing with analytically these two categories and the relationship between them. Azusa then is early Pentecostalism in North America, which was seen as wild, uncouth, and demonic. Many radical Pentecostal scholars, such as Harvey Cox and Walter Hollenweger, have offered a genealogical reading of early Pentecostalism by arguing that the early Pentecostal movement at Azusa cannot be interpreted primarily through Western doctrine and belief. Instead, interpreting early Pentecostalism is about the centering of the body and desire in order to redescribe Christian faith as new relations of radical intimacy, longing, and belonging. Early Pentecostalism was an experience of the Spirit that joined black flesh to other flesh in desiring, living, and loving together. It first announced and fleshed fugitive, more liberative patterns of communion, love, and justice, contrasted to the deeply segregated character of American churches and society. At Azusa, Christian identity and Christian faithfulness would no longer be seen primarily through Christian orthodoxy or simply right belief. And what I have here in mind that I'll be talking about throughout the lectures is this idea of right belief as a set of cognitive propositions, a set of propositions that we give cognitive assent to, right? And so this becomes then how we measure and think about right belief and therefore Christian identity. But of course, as we see through much of African American theological and religious production, what good is right belief if one can dehumanize and subjugate in practice? Think here, slave masters preaching Jesus, yet selling black people the next day on the auction block. Right? Azusa does ask one to ponder, what is the relationship between belief and practice? And might we think about belief in relative terms as we discern how beliefs illuminate or harm the world around us? And I was thinking more about this. I think I would go a bit further and say, actually, what I'm after in this new project is a way of rethinking the category of belief itself, right? And you're going to see this in lectures 2 and 3, that what we need is a new epistemic sort of invocation of how we think about belief in and of itself, right? And so I do think that this reading I offer of Azusa is decolonial. Drawing on Walter Mignolo, Aimé Césaire, and Oscar Garcia Johnson, decoloniality refers to the epistemic approaches and political projects opposed to the twin pillars of Western civilization: coloniality, political project, and modernity. An epistemic project ushered in by the Enlightenment period or Age of Reason. Decolonial thinkers expose the epistemic and political hegemony of Western categories and how these categories have degraded and dehumanized non-European populations in the quest to civilize and save them. Brings us back to the image of Charles Long, right? The way in which legitimate or dominant regimes of knowledge function as a prison house of thought that facilitate dehumanization by design, right? So this is part of the argument among some of the decolonial thinkers that I've just mentioned, is that the very categories, the very epistemic foundations of how we think about the form of theological knowledge and thought in this case, has degraded and dehumanized non-European populations in the quest to civilize and save them. As Algerian theorist and poet Aimé Césaire reminds us, Christianity was not just a handmaiden to the European colonizing project, but was the epistemic context that made possible such howling savagery, to use his words. Christian orthodoxy and its dominant categories conclude that unchristian, non-European peoples were no more than primitive folks engaged in demonic and backward practices. Azusa, then, is born and interpreted through this matrix of coloniality. Its form of religious experience and expression are filtered through this colonial logic. It is nothing more than demonic danger and savagery dressed up as Christian difference to white ministers. So then I offer a decolonial reading of Azusa in the sense that Azusa's liturgical life and social practices exercise epistemic disobedience in the face of European colonial logic, funded and fueled by Christian orthodoxy and its racial and capitalist logics. The power of a decolonial approach in interpreting Azusa is that it not only tracks how colonial logics operate within the cultural context of Azusa, but also how previously colonized or subjugated people at Azusa resist through epistemic disobedience. So it's not just that their religious rituals and practices are simply practices, right? But part of what I'm arguing is that the religious rituals and practices offer a new epistemology, a different epistemology that is seeking not only to disrupt, but to rupture this colonial matrix out of which they are being interpreted and represented. A decolonial approach is able to capture how the religious practices of the enslaved was the privileging and implementation of border knowledge or subaltern reason. Azusa members had a different sense of how God is discerned and known. This will become a major point for my next two lectures. Again, they have a different sense of how God is discerned and known in and through their bodies and religious rituals, which mediate divine presence rather than simply relying on philosophical and theological beliefs, again, propositions that we simply give cognitive assent to determine the content of who God is and what God does. I'm not making the argument that critical explication is not important, right? But that the problem is when it becomes the litmus test in a way, right, of thinking about, in this case, Christian identity, proper religious experience and belief. For my work, a decolonial approach does not simply attend to the question of how to include previously subjugated communities into the dominant Christian categories, but attempts to expose how the European colonial Christian gaze shapes the discursive and material fields out of which Christian claims and meanings are being thought and performed in the first place. Claims about Christian identity, ideas of Christian faithfulness, ideas of the human, and more. A decolonial reading of Azusa challenges Christian theology in this way and asks what theological approaches might be fruitful in demonstrating how this community resists theologically, and what that teaches us about God and the world around us. So how does this decolonial reading of Azusa remap some of Christian theology's methodological orientations, aims, and tasks? For these lectures, I can only provide the contours. For certain, Azusa's religious life offers a different account of Christian faith and practice that is oriented not only towards Christian multiplicity, but religious pluralism. Azusa's enactment of the Spirit is not singularly a reflection on the third person of the Trinity, nor is it simply a theorization of the relations of the Godhead, which does not address the material relationality and fleshly communion central to early Pentecostalism and its somatic practices of the Spirit. Instead of starting with a metaphysical Trinitarianism in relation to one's view of the Spirit, a flesh-centered Pentecostalism instead asks, in the words of Michael Velker, where is the Spirit of God? Following liberationist and womanist theologies, the Spirit acts and rests decisively upon the selfless, suffering, and despised Jewish Messiah, in contrast to abstract pneumatologies that often ask, what is the Spirit? Instead of where is the Spirit and how is the Spirit revealed? Right, so you can see I'm wanting to walk away from sort of some of these classical claims of ontology, right? You can see me sort of in saying that Azusa necessitates a different starting point and beginning as a way of capturing the identity of the Spirit and the work of the Spirit. As Velker reminds us, similar to the suffering Christ, God's Spirit acts in, on, and through fleshly, perishable, earthly life, and precisely in this way attests to God's story and glory of salvation and redemption. In other words, the Spirit can only be understood from within the concrete histories of vulnerable communities, which include human and more than human flesh of the world. For certain, my proposal offers a different starting point and inflection related to Spirit talk, without speaking of the Spirit and flesh together, especially at the site of marginality. I want to emphasize especially at the site of marginality. I'm not making the argument that the Spirit is reduced only to sites of marginality. So I want to offer that distinction there. I think this has been somewhat of, for me, a critical distinction that I want to make maybe in conversation as a critical contrast to some of liberationist and even womanist theologies, for that matter, is that especially at the site of marginality, but there is a sense that the way in which God moves through the materiality of the world moves far beyond that to something that is incredibly new, surprising, and unorthodox. Early Pentecostalism is about embodying then an eschatological vision of what the Spirit is doing within the materiality of the world, including human flesh. The relationship between theology and culture is also important when reflecting on Azusa, a conversation that is deeply debated among Christian theologians and ethicists. In Azusa Reimagined, I maintain that Charles Parham, who I've been mentioning, is not sort of an aberration of Christian theological thought. He's not an anomaly of Christian theological thought at the turn of the 20th century. He is representative of Christian thought at the turn of the 20th century. Parham is representative of the theological categories white mainline churches use through which to interpret racial and religious others. The blackness of Azusa through slave religious practices was interpreted as categorically demonic. Many white visitors, such as Parham, speak of the blackness of Azusa as religious anarchy. For many Christian white leaders, the experience of the Spirit at Azusa was cultural, not theological. Yet for Seymour and other leaders of Azusa, the experience of the Spirit was deeply theological. How do we adjudicate Parham and Seymour's interpretation here? Parham's indictment of Azusa as demonic is based on the claim that Azusa's activity is cultural, and what Parham means here is not doctrinal and therefore sinful and unchristian. But the question must be reversed. When is Parham's interpretations of Azusa cultural, racist, and therefore sinful, that in some ways he's reading through, again, this colonial matrix of power that I've just discussed? This question disrupts the long-standing theological assumption that white people have theology and black people have culture. This question also challenges the ways in which theology has functioned as cultural property of the West, to use J. Cameron Carter's words. We might address this question of how to adjudicate the claims of Parham and Seymour phenomenologically. Charles Harrison Mason, founder of COGIC, doesn't describe his experience at Azusa in terms of confirming doctrinal or conceptual truths. He doesn't describe it in that way, but rather he rids himself of objective facts as he opens himself up to the phenomena. In contrast, Parham goes to great lengths to doctrinally conceive and interpret the experiences of Azusa. The rational and doctrinal are everything for Parham, as he even states that, quote, very few of them talk in real tongues, end quote. What is at stake in this contrast of Parham and Seymour is that Parham's doctrinal turn could not make the blackness of Azusa legible. This blackness is heathenistic and therefore not relevant to what true Pentecost is. The problem is what Parham's discourse represents, the epistemic conditions of coloniality that grounded Christian discourse. However, for black leaders at Azusa, the salvaging of blackness to the domain of the cultural as theological, and that's a really important point I'll be talking about, that they're salvaging their own experiences, their religious rituals and so forth, to the domain of the cultural as the theological, reveals the plural enactments of the Spirit. Azusa then represents a theological form, I would argue, of decoloniality in response to the colonial impulses grounding dominant white Christian discourses of the day. Consequently, this erasure of the blackness of Azusa in most white Pentecostal and theological scholarship, I would argue, is about the unsayability of blackness itself, a kind of anxiety among white scholarship, although most of white Pentecostalism in the U.S. emerges precisely out of this unspoken, unsayable blackness. This is the irony. My decolonial reading of Azusa demonstrates the indispensable relationship between theology and culture, at least methodologically, as you can already see. One must turn to cultural and material practices, cultural production and material production, to understand how the Spirit blows, erupts, dances in and through bodies, seizes, shouts, weeps and wails, how it exceeds orthodox propriety, how it provokes the status quo and prophetically breaks forth with a radical critique through embodying the beloved community in the here and now. Theologian Jim Perkinson reminds us that, quote, the Spirit cannot be put in doctrine by definition. It is the anti-name that enamors every tongue tripped by love, seeking not a word, but a kiss. The Spirit cannot be chained in a word because it is before language and after time, end quote. The Spirit is eruptive and transgressive. The Spirit inspires movement, I would argue, I'm arguing throughout these lectures, from a univocal theology to a constructive theology, a decolonial theology of Christian multiplicity and religious pluralism. Azusa and its flesh-centered practices of spirit help rethink the methodological task of Christian theology and ethics. Some scholars have written that the most important contribution of early Pentecostalism has been the revalorization of the charismata, right, the gifts, that is, rather than theological analysis, and you know what I'm thinking. I think that is misguided. As seen at Azusa, Pentecostal spirituality and practice offer profound theological analysis at the level of fleshly practice, which reframes some of Western Christianity's basic theological categories and even prospects for social ethics. For Pentecostal practice, it is only through the joining together of our material lives in desiring, living, and loving that Christian theology is possible, that the church is possible. So then Pentecostalism, at least the Pentecostalism that I'm arguing for through this decolonial theology of spirit, it then asks, what is theology? Right? It takes us back to the basic fundamental question. What is theology? What constitutes the doing or becoming of theology? How does Pentecostal religious experience revolutionize how we think about Christian identity, which mainly has been anchored through doctrine in the West? Walter Hollenweger is correct that Pentecostalism is not simply based on doctrinal agreement, but shared experiences of the Spirit, oriented towards justice and love. The question for Pentecostalism then centers around how God's Spirit is manifested and revealed, how God's Spirit is manifested and revealed in and through the corporal materiality of our lives in diverse ways. How does God's Spirit move in and through all races, ethnicities, nationalities, genders, sexualities, more than human others, and so forth, in ways that presage God's radical desire for us, to commune with us and offer us quality of life at personal and political levels? This question, I believe, orients Christian faith toward profound transformation. And this returns me then to the question I asked at the beginning: what is Christian faith? Whoever denies that one can do proper theology in these categories will have to prove that the Bible is not a theological book. Our way of doing theology is a culturally biased form. There are other equally relevant forms of doing theology. Pentecostalism offers raw materials and elements for such an alternative methodology, end quote. In these lectures, I maintain that a flesh or materialist-centered theology of spirit offers raw materials, so to speak, to help Christian theology embrace alternative ways of understanding who God is and what God is up to in the world. So the way forward for these lectures in conclusion. As stated at the start of this lecture, my overall exploration is that a decolonial theology of spirit attempts to avoid the domestication of our ideas about God and Christian faith more broadly. Think again, Long's image of the prison house of thought. I want us to keep that image in mind at the forefront. Through spirit language, the remaining 3 lectures I will deliver seek to offer a materialist yet apophatic view of God through the Spirit's operations in the world, which frees theology to function as a discursive space and practice of wonder and freedom. God desires to be experienced and loved by us within the material worlds we inhabit, not intellectually mastered by us through abstract forms of reasoning. And I think a decolonial theology of spirit highlights this essential material yet apophatic relationship to God and the ethical implications of this view for Christian faith when engaging the broader world marked by difference and injustice, as well as Long repeatedly talks about in religious experience and the cataloging and descriptions of religious experience, as well as holding opacity and silence as key, important traits, variables, in how we speak of God in the world. So a view of what's to come. In the second lecture, I argue for spirit as first word of theology in offering a more capacious view of who God is and what God does. I argue that we might reroute theology through spirit language so that theology can bear witness to a more expansive, materialist, and emancipatory view of what God is doing in the world at personal and political levels, In arguing for spirit as first word of theology and its ethical import for practices of Christian faith, I foreground a materialist conception of spirit. Exploring the relationship between spirit and flesh, much of the work I'll be doing is thinking about these two categories through Black feminism, Black womanist pneumatology, and new materialisms, in order to ask, where is the spirit in pondering the story of redemption, instead of what is the spirit? I think the where question opens us up to God's more expansive and revelatory presence beyond our doctrinal categories that often tend to domesticate and suppress how God is actually active in the fleshly material worlds we inhabit. In Lecture 3, I explore how this materialist, flesh-centered view of the Spirit apprehends God in an apophatic register. I offer an Afro-Pentecostal meditation on God by exploring the God we meet at Azusa, arguing that members of Azusa encounter divine irresistibility. Through thickly describing the religious practice of tarrying, again, Tarrying, the religious practice of tarrying at Azusa, I demonstrate the epistemic and ethical significance of divine irresistibility. This irresistible God opens us up to the luring power of divine desire. It's not that simply we desire God, but that God desires to be with and for God's creation. At Azusa, there is a desire to know God, but there is also a desire by God to be known by us. There is a mutual vulnerability expressed between the divine and creation, especially among places and people that are deemed disposable and rejected. Of critical importance is that the irresistible nature of God through the Spirit drew Azusa members into an experience of being beloved in concrete ways within a society that identified them as without worth or value. And although encounters of divine irresistibility make divine presence felt in the material worlds we inhabit, it does not fully capture and exhaust God. This is the apophatic dimension. God, nevertheless, is apprehended apophatically, reminding us that our ideas about God function to facilitate practices of love, devotion, justice, and wonder, rather than intellectual mastery of God and all of the terrible, dominating, hegemonic projects that result from that, from this project to master. We might take our cue from Azusa and engage God talk in ways that center divine desire at both personal and political levels of existence, while remaining open to divine mystery, opacity, and silence. Wonder. The final lecture explores the ethical implications of my decolonial theology of spirit by commending a certain theological mood to be against practices of Christian belonging, which do not interrogate dogmatic forms of theological beliefs and social practices that dehumanize by design. I am after an account of belonging that compels us to move out into places and spaces where land and people that are often considered disposable, to discern what visions of belonging might be in keeping with the Spirit's work of love and justice. I recognize that I'm trying to deliver a tall order in these lectures, but I do hope you will think with me during these next 2 days on how we might embrace an undomesticated faith, and in doing so, transform our relationship with God and others in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Day. I would look forward to sitting in your classroom to hear this fleshed out even further. I was thinking of so many questions and points of conversation I would love to engage you in, and look forward to the Q&A as a result of that. As I think about, particularly coming from a perspective where the Spirit is not the most comfortable part of conversation with many of us in terms of our Protestant upbringing and background. But I continue to think, one of the questions that I kept writing over and over again was is whether this decolonial reading of Azusa in the past has a powerful message of hope and relevance and liberation for the church in the future. And it seems to me that's one of the places you're pointing us, and that's exciting for me, especially as you talk about the materiality of the Spirit and the spiritual way in which materiality then functions, that then takes us into things like anti-racism and hope for. So it's an exciting look in the past to help us into the future. Thank you. Thank you. And I also love the wonderful way in which, like a good speaker, you tease us about what's in the future, so we're ready and looking forward to what's going to come. So thank you very much. I could go on, but we have other things to do tonight. Let us together again thank Dr. Day for this intriguing and exciting lecture. Our closing hymn this evening is hymn number 287, and I do want to remind us that we do have a wonderful organ recital that's going to be taking place at 7:30. Many of you know the wonderful organ that was built for this space, so to hear this organ in this space is something I hope you will stay to take opportunity to listen to as Doug plays for us. Again, hymn number 287. Those who are able in body or in spirit, please stand.
Thank you, Clay. Good evening. I'm Doug Brown, and I'm so happy that you all are here to hear really the inaugural recital for this brand new instrument that we have that was built for this space here at Watts Chapel. It arrived in August of last year, so it is still has the new organ smell. A couple things I want you to know about the instrument before we start. First of all, this is a 100% pipe organ, so I think all the versatility you'll hear in the course of the next hour, none of this is coming from speakers or any kind of other tricks. It's 100% a pipe organ. The other thing it's really interesting to know about it is it's a really small instrument. So it's a 7-rank pipe organ, and to put that in perspective, the Ginter Park organ is 49 ranks. First Baptist downtown is maybe 96 ranks. This is 7. So it's really, really wonderful to hear what a very small instrument can do in this space, and especially built by such a terrific builder. This past year, we not only had a new instrument arrive, but we also were fortunate to receive a grant, a worship renewal grant from the Calvin Institute for 5 events to welcome this new instrument. And so what some of this performance tonight is kind of a little bit of a greatest hits from those 5 events. So we had, most recently, counting backwards, we had in April an evensong service led by Dr. Rob Lehman. We had in February a service to celebrate the organ and the Black Church, led by Dr. Jonathan Berryman. We commissioned a piece for December, a series of miniatures for Christmas by composer Caroline Melanet. There was a global hymn sing in October, led by Paul Vasile. And then the first service we had with this instrument was in September. We had an inaugural sermon preached by Don Salyers. And the first thing that this instrument did in that context was a hymn. So we started with a good old hymn number 1, Holy, Holy, Holy. And just sort of ease the instrument in gently. So that is the first thing we'll do. After that, there is the much beloved Elgar Nimrod, which this instrument does with great joy. And then after that, we will have a hymn from the service of global hymnody that we had in October. But let's start with hymn number 1, which, as it says in the program, will begin a cappella for maximum effect. So, hymn number 1. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, early in the morning, the sun shall rise to thee. Holy, 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 mercy the next two pieces, the first of them is a piece by J.S. Bach, certainly the most significant composer of all time for the organ. We know Bach's Toccata and Fugue, and we know some of the chorale preludes. He composed 6 trio sonatas that are not all that popular with us organists. They sound easy, and they are just the opposite. So, and we organists shy away from such things generally, but they're really delightful pieces, and they're sort of chamber pieces for the organ. 3 independent lines, 1 for each hand and 1 for the feet, and it shows off a different side of this instrument, just sort of a quiet, sort of nimble, responsive, gentle side. And then after that, we'll play. I will play one of the pieces commissioned for this instrument and for the space. The first of Caroline Maloney's 7 Christmas miniatures for organ. Time of the Evening Breeze. Anybody recognize that, where that is from Scripture? It's a good one. Genesis 3. So yeah, the first reading. And a really beautiful sort of piece for evening as well. I loved commissioning Keri to do these pieces, in part because I adore her work, and also because she had never written for the organ before. So it's always wonderful to introduce a composer to the organ for the first time. So Bach and some Maloney. William Bolcom is a living American composer and wrote 4 just phenomenal and incredibly inventive books of gospel hymn preludes. True story, about a month ago I was sitting in the space and I knew which of these preludes I was going to play for this recital, and I tried it out and it just didn't really work at all. And I thought about the Rock of Ages prelude in these books, and I thought there was no way on earth this would work on an instrument this small. This is absurd to even think this. The last time I performed it, it was an instrument many times the size. It really just demands a really large instrument to tell its story. And something in our organ said, well, why don't you try it? So, so I did that, and it really is, it's quite amazing that any 7-rank instrument could pull it off. The Rock of Ages setting by Bolcom is, it tells a story of a legend of a sunken cathedral underwater that rises out of the water triumphantly and sinks back into the sea. At the end, there is a Claude Debussy piano piece entitled La Cathédrale Engloutie, the same title, and Bolcom's work is definitely a nod at the Debussy piece. So that is it is a very 20th century sort of sound. It's very it's lots of handfuls of notes, and we'll use almost all the pipes at once, probably at some point. So I hope you enjoyed that storytelling that it does. It's really quite amazing. And just so you don't think that that's all that that Bolcom does, just has me lay my hands on the keyboard all at once. We'll start with a really gentle prelude he has on Abide With Me, again in the evening theme. We will then sing Rock of Ages to remind ourselves of that tune, so we're on the lookout for it, and 2 pieces by Bolcom. At the February service with Jonathan Berryman, he designed a beautiful, beautiful program of music from the Black church, and I think my very favorite moment of that was the transition from the hymn "Great Is Thy Faithfulness" into the C.C. Winan song "Goodness of God." So I wanted to to do that again. I love a good idea that isn't my own, and so I really am excited about doing this again, and excited on so many levels. Andrew Bird, who's an extraordinary student musician here, is at the piano, and I love how the organ and the piano work well together. And Victoria Fitzgerald is here to sing this like no one has sung at the seminary before. Just extraordinary, extraordinary talent downstairs. And so I will do as I tried to do in February, which is to keep up. Andrew will introduce the hymn and we'll sing together. And then the last three things we'll do, one evening hymn that we did at the evening song service, The Day Thou Gavest, Lord, is ended. And then a colleague of mine, the Adagio from the Vidor Symphony No. 5 is a favorite of his, and I thought it would be wonderful to play that, and then finish with the much beloved toccata from that same symphony, in part to prove that our organ can play the Vidor toccata, which it can and does it beautifully. So I'm so grateful for this instrument. I'm grateful to Brian Blunt and to the administration of the seminary for making this happen, for Evelyn Terry for her amazing fundraising, and Richard Wong, and for all who sat on the committee for the organ. This is just such a wonderful instrument that I think will be loved in this place for hundreds of years. So just wonderful to have it here, and grateful for you all tonight. So a hymn and two pieces of Vidor.
once again, please join me in thanking Drew McFadden, Andrew Bird, and Victoria Fitzgerald, along with Maestro Doug Brown, for sharing their gifts of music with us. Two very brief announcements before we depart. The golf cart is going to be parked out front. If anyone wishes to have a ride to their vehicle or to their place of campus abode this night, you are welcome to take advantage of that. And also, very graciously, our SPRUNT lecturer, Dr. Keri Day, has offered to come and join us in the morning at 8 o'clock for our informal conversation. You'll have an opportunity to see her there and speak with her if you wish. That is 8 o'clock in the Holderness Dining Room in Richmond Hall. We hope you'll come and join us. There will be plenty of food and an opportunity for good fellowship. Rest well. We'll see you in the morning.